In December 2020, Britain was forced to confront something it had never imagined possible. A quiet family man living in a small English town, the kind of neighbor who nods politely, keeps his garden tidy, and helps carry shopping bags, was about to be unmasked as one of the most disturbing criminals the country had ever seen. His name was David Fuller. But the world was about to learn another name for him. A predator, hiding in plain sight. A man whose crimes spanned decades, whose depravity pushed the limits of human imagination, and whose double life shattered hundreds of families. The story begins in Kent, often called the Garden of England. Postcard landscapes, orchards, historic villages, and the famous white cliffs of Dover. A region where life is slow, safe, predictable. At least, that's what people believed. Not far from there lies the elegant, wealthy spa town of Royal Tunbridge Wells, a place once visited by British aristocrats seeking healing waters and quiet summer retreats. A town so respectable it carries the royal title granted in 1909. But in 2020, the town's peace shattered when a team of investigators knocked on the door of a house in Heathfield, East Sussex. Inside lived a 66-year-old electrician, married, 4 children, birdwatching enthusiast, amateur photographer, hospital employee for nearly a decade. To anyone looking from the outside, David Fuller was harmless, ordinary, forgettable. But appearances lie. And inside that house, police were about to uncover something so horrific that even seasoned investigators would later admit nothing had prepared us for what we found. The officers had come because of a breakthrough in a cold case, 2 unsolved murders, dating back to 1987, known as the bedsit murders. New forensic techniques had identified a suspect after 33 years. That suspect was David Fuller. But as chilling as that revelation was, it was nothing compared to what they were about to discover next. During the search of his home, hidden behind cupboards and false panels, police found several hard drives, encrypted, concealed, protected. When they finally accessed the files, they froze. Thousands of images, thousands of videos, all showing the same man, David Fuller, engaging in acts so depraved, so beyond moral comprehension, that some officers required psychological support afterward. For 15 years, he had been violating bodies inside hospital morgue facilities, exploiting his job to access victims who could no longer defend themselves. The youngest was only 9. The oldest was 100. The man they were arresting wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator operating inside a system that failed to stop him for more than a decade. And as investigators would soon discover, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. 40 kilometers from London, in the calm, postcard-perfect county of Kent, life usually flows like an oil painting. Villages made of brick cottages, trimmed hedges, quiet streets, where everyone knows each other by name. It's the last place you expect a monster to hide. But that's the thing with predators. They don't always lurk in dark alleys. Sometimes they work in bright, sterile buildings, surrounded by people who would swear they're harmless. When investigators first turned their attention to David Fuller, nothing about him made sense. 66 years old, soft-spoken, an electrician in a hospital, married, 4 children, a man who cycled on weekends, watched birds, photographed concerts, someone who blended perfectly into the wallpaper of ordinary life. But on the 3rd of December 2020, when officers knocked on the door of his home in Heathfield, it wasn't because they suspected him of some minor offense. They were there for the reopening of a cold case that had haunted Tunbridge Wells for 33 years. 2 women raped and murdered in 1987. Crime so brutal that the town had lived in fear for months. And after decades of nothing, a single DNA match suddenly pointed straight to David Fuller. Police expected to arrest a murderer who had slipped through their fingers for decades. What they found was something far worse. During the search, several hard drives hidden around the house were seized. And when the technicians opened them, even the most seasoned investigators froze. Thousands of files, 14,000 photos and videos, documenting acts so depraved that many officers needed psychological support after watching them. Fuller had filmed himself sexually abusing corpses inside morgues, bodies placed on chairs on the floor, repositioned in different poses. Assaults committed over 15 years, meticulously cataloged. He wrote down names, ages, times of death, information he obtained directly from the morgue register. He researched some victims afterward as if wanting to get to know them once he was done. All the victims were women, children, teenagers, adults, elderly women. The youngest was 9. The oldest had reached 100. The discovery shook the United Kingdom. Families suddenly learned that the body of their loved one had been violated after death, a reality so unbearable that the health secretary ordered an independent public inquiry. The hospital administration was accused of catastrophic negligence, and yet, beyond the institutional scandal, the worst part remained this: without the reopening of the 1987 murders, David Fuller might never have been caught. To understand how this man lived undetected for decades, investigators had to go back in time and reconstruct the path of a predator who hid behind a quiet face and a maintenance badge. Because this ordinary-looking man wasn't just a necrophile operating in morgues, he had once been a killer in the streets of Tunbridge Wells, long before anyone imagined what he was truly capable of. Investigators retraced the chain of events that had led them back to 1987, back to 2 murders that had terrorized Royal Tunbridge Wells, a town that had never seen anything like it before. A peaceful place where violent crime was so rare that police officers didn't even specialize in homicide. And yet, in the space of a few months, 2 young women were attacked with a brutality that no one could understand at the time. The first was Wendy Nell, 25 years old, a quiet life, a stable relationship, a small studio of apartment with a faulty back window, she had reported to her landlord. On the night of 22nd June 1987, her boyfriend walked her home after dinner. They made plans for the weekend. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The next morning, Wendy didn't show up for work. No call, no message. Her colleagues immediately knew something was wrong. When her boyfriend rushed to her flat and opened the door, he stepped into a nightmare. Wendy lay naked on her bed, beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted. No signs of forced entry. The killer had slipped in through that faulty window, the one Wendy kept asking to have repaired. As police examined the crime scene, they collected biological samples. But 1987 wasn't the era of forensic breakthroughs. DNA profiling was still experimental. What they had wasn't enough to identify anyone. 5 months later, it happened again. On 24th November 1987, 20-year-old waitress Caroline Pierce was abducted right outside her home. Witnesses heard a scream, then a car speeding away. Caroline's body was found 3 weeks later, dumped in a marsh more than 60 kilometers from town. She too had been beaten, strangled, sexually assaulted. Her clothes were never recovered, a chilling detail that suggested the killer kept them. The similarities terrified investigators. Same violence, same patterns, same type of victim. The press named the unknown attacker the bedsit killer. Women in Tunbridge Wells started checking their locks twice, sleeping with lights on, moving in with friends. No one felt safe. Police interviewed thousands of people. Among them was a man named David Fuller, a regular customer at the photography shop where Wendy worked, and someone who had eaten at the restaurant where Caroline waited tables. But back then, nothing pointed to him. No witness, no usable DNA. No reason to suspect the quiet electrician who lived nearby. As years passed, the case went cold, but the biological samples were preserved carefully, almost obsessively, waiting for a future where science could speak louder than witnesses, and that future finally arrived. In the early 2000s, Kent police began reviewing old unsolved cases. When the bedsit murders were re-examined, forensic technology had finally advanced enough to extract a full DNA profile. The sample was run through the national database, and something unexpected happened. A hit appeared. Not a random member of the public, not a new offender, a hospital maintenance technician named David Fuller, the same man who wandered the halls of Tunbridge Wells Hospital, the same man with unrestricted access to the morgue, the same man who had worked quietly for decades, fixing lights and electrical panels while hiding the darkest compulsions imaginable. A man who had killed 2 young women in 1987, then spent the next 33 years violating the dead without ever being caught. Everything about him became suspect. Everything about his life took on a new, horrifying meaning. His night shifts, his access cards, his habit of lingering where he didn't belong, his old burglary convictions, forgotten by everyone except the database that flagged him decades later. And now, in 2020, every secret he thought he had buried was about to surface. The more investigators dug into David Fuller's past, the more they realized something terrifying. This man had been hiding in plain sight his entire life, not just as a murderer, but as a predator whose deviance had taken root long before 1987. David Fuller was born in 1954 in Portsmouth. On paper, his childhood looked ordinary. No severe trauma, no broken home, nothing that would immediately explain the kind of monstrosity he would later unleash. He grew up like any other kid of the era. School, friends, a fairly structured environment. The kind of background that makes his later crimes even more chilling, because it meant he didn't become a monster because of what happened to him. He became one because of who he was. After school, he trained as an electrician, a technical, meticulous job, one that suited his solitary, methodical personality. He wasn't loud, he wasn't violent, he wasn't charismatic, he was invisible. The kind of man no one looks at twice. But beneath that silence, something was already wrong. And as soon as he reached adulthood, the cracks began to show. After moving to Kent, David was arrested several times for burglary. On the surface, these looked like minor crimes, but the details revealed something much darker. He didn't steal at random. He targeted homes where women lived alone. And once inside, he didn't rush. He stayed. He inspected their belongings, their underwear, their most intimate spaces. He lingered like an intruder, not just in their homes, but in their lives. Investigators later realized these burglaries weren't just thefts. They were rehearsals, dress rehearsals for domination, voyeurism, control. He wasn't interested in money, he was interested in the women themselves. Breaking into their homes allowed him to invade their intimacy. But it wasn't enough, not for long. And that's when the escalation began. From entering their homes, to fantasizing about their bodies, to eventually taking their lives. When Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce were murdered in 1987, David was already primed for violence. The way he broke in, the way he attacked in their own private spaces, the way he inflicted humiliation and degradation. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't random, it was purposeful. And after killing, he didn't stop. What investigators discovered later was that for him, the boundary between life and death barely mattered. Whether a woman was breathing or not, what mattered was that she couldn't resist, that she couldn't speak, that she couldn't escape. Necrophilia wasn't a late developing deviation. It was the culmination of everything he had built towards. Domination pushed to its absolute extreme. But if he felt the urge to dominate, he also had the rare ability to compartmentalize. In public, he seemed normal, harmless. He got married, divorced, married again, had children, smiled at neighbors, played the role of the average British father without ever slipping. He was able to walk into his house after sexually abusing a corpse and sit at the dinner table as if nothing had happened, as if he had just finished a normal workday. That kind of psychological split is the hallmark of psychopaths. An ability to seal off different parts of themselves like compartments in a submarine. But even as he lived this double life, his deviance wasn't limited to one fantasy. The search of his home in 2020 revealed another disturbing dimension. An enormous collection of child pornography accumulated over decades. It reinforced what experts already suspected, that David's sexuality was fragmented, deviant, and deeply rooted. Necrophile, pedophile, murderer, voyeur, predator. All those identities were wrapped into one man who lived unnoticed among thousands. As forensic psychologists studied him, one conclusion kept emerging. David Fuller had probably always been like this. He didn't turn into a necrophile. He didn't become a murderer. These impulses were there from the beginning, growing silently in a man who had learned early on that invisibility was the perfect camouflage. And this camouflage worked, because after committing 2 murders, he built a facade so convincing that no one suspected anything. His colleagues described him as quiet, polite, professional. He was always the man willing to help, the one you trusted with the keys. the one you asked to fix a problem. In 1989, he joined Kent and Sussex Hospital. And within that environment, a place filled with death, vulnerability, and opportunity, David Fuller found the perfect ecosystem for his darkest desires. He had no contact with patients, no reason to be supervised, no pressure from superiors. As a maintenance technician, he was everywhere and nowhere at once. His badge opened every door. His excuses were always technical, always believable. And at some point, around 2005, he took the final step. He walked into a morgue, not to fix a light, but to touch the dead, to violate them, to record it, to return again and again like an addict whose supply was infinite. What allowed him to continue was not just the flaws in the hospital system, it was a deceit. It was his own cold, calculated evolution. He knew forensic techniques. He followed news of criminal investigations. He studied how killers were caught. He adapted. He wore gloves. He avoided bodies flagged as infectious. He used blind spots in CCTV cameras. He learned the staffing hours. He exploited everything. He was one of the most dangerous types of predators, the ones who learn, who adapt, who evolve. For over 30 years, he perfected this hidden life, until 2020, when DNA from a crime 3 decades old finally caught up with him. And while police were solving the murders of Wendy and Caroline, they were also uncovering something far more monstrous. David Fuller had killed 2 young women, but his true number of victims could never be counted. He had assaulted the dead, children, elderly women, teenagers, mothers, grandmothers, people whose families trusted the hospital to care for them with dignity, people who never imagined that their last moments on earth would be violated after death by a man in a maintenance uniform. When investigators confronted David with the hard drives, he didn't deny anything. He simply admitted it without an ounce of remorse, because he didn't have any. And that lack of remorse, that void where empathy should exist, was the final confirmation of what he truly was. A man who lived an entire lifetime pretending to be ordinary, while committing acts that defy imagination. Once investigators realized the scale of what they had uncovered, the tone of the entire case shifted. This wasn't just a murderer finally unmasked after 33 years. This was a man whose second, hidden life was far darker than anything anyone could have imagined. And now that the mask had fallen, everything began to collapse around him. When police finally confronted David Fuller in the interrogation room, they didn't start with the murders. They started with the hard drives. Thousands of files, thousands of acts, years of abuse, meticulously recorded, cataloged, and archived. They placed a folder in front of him, opened it, and let the silence do the work. David looked at the images of his own hands, his own face, his own body, committing atrocities in a morgue. And in that moment, he understood something very simple. There was no escape. Not from the murders, not from the necrophilia, not from the decades of secrets. And so, without resistance, without emotion, without hesitation, he admitted what he had done to the dead. Not why, not how it began, not what he felt, just the cold, factual acknowledgement that yes, it was him. But when the conversation turned to the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, the mask came back on. For those two crimes, he maintained his innocence. He insisted that the DNA match was a mistake, that the police had misinterpreted the evidence. He clung to denial like a life raft, because he knew what admitting to murder would mean. A necrophile is one thing. A necrophile and a murderer is something else entirely. But the evidence didn't lie. DNA pulled from a crime scene in 1987 matched perfectly with the man sitting in that chair in 2020. The same genetic profile found on Wendy, then again on Caroline, then again on items found at his home. He had no way out. And the pressure finally broke him. David Fuller confessed to the murders, not in detail. He refused to explain anything, refused to revisit what he had done. He still wanted to control the narrative, to keep something for himself, even in the face of overwhelming truth. But everyone knew exactly why he didn't want to talk. Because confronting what he had done in 1987 would have required acknowledging what kind of man he truly was long before the morgue. Still, the truth was out. And now investigators were left with a new impossible task: identifying the victims on the thousands of videos. Not the living victims, but the dead ones. Families who had buried their loved ones now had to hear the unhearable: that their mother, sister, daughter, wife, grandmother, even their child had been violated by a hospital employee after death. Police had to knock on doors and deliver the kind of sentence no human being should ever have to hear. Imagine someone telling you, "We have reason to believe the body of your loved one was sexually abused in the morgue." No explanation softens that. No apology erases it. There is no language in the world that makes that sentence survivable. Some families collapsed. Some screamed. Some stood in shock, unable to form words. Others wanted every detail, every second, every truth, no matter how unbearable. Many simply broke. One mother learned that the body of her 9-year-old daughter, her child, had been assaulted multiple times. Another family learned that their grandmother, who lived to 100, had not rested in peace. And in other cases, the police had to say the worst sentence of all: "We don't know yet if your loved one was assaulted, but we cannot exclude it." Fear, horror, rage. A collective wound unlike anything the UK had seen in modern history. Hospitals came under immediate fire. The NHS Trust responsible for Tunbridge Wells in Kent and Sussex was accused of catastrophic negligence, security failures, ignored protocols, missing access logs, unlockable morgue doors, blind spots in CCTV coverage, undertrained staff, no supervision for contractors, a perfect storm. And David Fuller had exploited every weakness. The British government launched an independent inquiry. The NHS ordered sweeping reforms. But none of that mattered to the families, not when the damage was unfixable. Meanwhile, David Fuller remained exactly as he had always been: quiet, calm, polite, emotionless. He did not apologize. He did not cry. He did not express regret. He simply accepted the facts the same way one accepts the weather: cold, detached, empty. And yet, behind that coldness, there was calculation. David had kept every file, every video, every photo, every detail. Not because he was proud, but because he needed to relive his acts whenever he wanted. Those hard drives were his private world, his trophies, his secret kingdom. By keeping those files, David Fuller had buried himself. When the trial began in November 2021, the courtroom was filled with families, some hiding tears, others shaking with anger, most unable to look at him without collapsing. David sat there silently, listening to the long list of charges being read aloud: murders, sexual violations, abuse of corpses, possession of illegal images. He didn't flinch. When the prosecution described what he had done to the bodies, sometimes the same one multiple times, he didn't look away. When a father cried while describing the pain of learning what had happened to his daughter's body, David didn't blink. It was as if he wasn't human. When the verdict came, it was unanimous, guilty of every charge. And the judge delivered one of the harshest condemnations ever pronounced in a UK courtroom, describing Fuller's acts as evil beyond all imagining, depravity scarcely conceivable, a level of moral corruption that defies understanding. David Fuller received life imprisonment with no possibility of release. He will die in prison. But even as he was being escorted out of the courtroom, handcuffed and escorted by guards, something became clear to everyone watching. This was not justice. Justice was impossible. Because nothing, no sentence, no prison, no punishment could undo what he had done to so many women, both living and dead. David Fuller destroyed families. He violated the sanctity of death. He exploited trust. He weaponized his invisibility. He slipped through the cracks of an entire system for more than 30 years. And when the doors of the courtroom finally closed behind him, Britain was forced to confront a terrifying truth. David Fuller didn't just murder 2 women. He betrayed the dead. And in doing so, he scarred the living forever. Even after the sentencing, the shock waves of the case didn't stop. In fact, for many families, the real nightmare began after David Fuller was locked away. Because justice doesn't bring closure when the crime itself is beyond understanding. For months, the police continued contacting families as digital forensic specialists reviewed every frame of the thousands of videos Fuller had kept. Each new identification reopened wounds. Each new confirmation forced another family to regrieve the person they had already buried, this time with a horror no one should ever have to imagine. Some families refused to watch the police footage, terrified of what they might see. Others insisted on knowing every detail. Some asked whether the body had suffered, whether it had been immediate, whether it had happened once or multiple times, whether it had happened before the funeral. The investigators, trained professionals, sometimes struggled not to break down while responding. Even in death, dignity matters, and David Fuller had stolen it. Meanwhile, hospitals across the country faced unprecedented scrutiny. The NHS Trust, responsible for Tunbridge Wells, was accused of failing its patients, not only in life but in death. Reports revealed that warnings had been ignored for years. Staff understaffed, security systems outdated. morgues accessible too easily, too often, by too many. A simple locked door could have prevented years of abuse. A proper camera placement could have exposed him. A functioning logging system could have flagged anomalies instantly. But none of that happened. And now every hospital in the UK had to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that similar failures might exist elsewhere. Inspections intensified. Morgue procedures were rewritten from scratch. Some facilities underwent complete overhauls. All because one man, quiet, polite, invisible, had revealed the vulnerability of the system. Psychologists who later analyzed David Fuller's behavior described him as a classic compartmentalizer, a man capable of living multiple lives simultaneously without letting one leak into the other. It explained how he could go from violating a corpse in the morgue to going home and cooking dinner with his wife. How he could commit acts of unimaginable depravity, yet remain calm, stable, and respected by those around him. But compartmentalization alone wasn't enough to explain the scale of his crimes. Experts found something else, a chilling, emotional flatness. David didn't fantasize about violence in the way most serial offenders do. He didn't relive the murders in his mind. He didn't feel compelled by rage or hatred. His deviance was clinical, detached, as if the bodies he violated weren't people at all, but objects he believed he had a right to use. In the rare interviews where he spoke after his conviction, David Fuller remained consistent. No remorse, no excuses, no justification. Not even attempts to blame childhood trauma or mental illness. He simply was what he was. And in a way, that made him even more terrifying. Hidden monsters are one thing. Monsters who don't even see themselves as monsters are another. For investigators, one question remained. Why did he stop killing the living after 1987? Why 2 murders, then decades of silence? The answer they reached was chilling in its logic. He didn't stop killing because he felt remorse. He stopped because he found something better. In a morgue, the dead can't scream. They can't fight. They can't report. They can't run. They can't resist. For someone obsessed with control, domination, and silence, David had found the perfect victims. And unlike living victims, these ones came to him every day, every week, delivered directly to the room where he worked. A conveyor belt of vulnerability. He didn't need to hunt anymore. The hunt came to him. The murders were the beginning, not the climax. A first taste, a first attempt, a first exploration of his darkest urges. But the morgue was the ultimate evolution of his deviance. Violence without risk, domination without witnesses, sexual assault without consequence, at least for a time. That's the truth most people struggle to grasp. David Fuller didn't escalate. He stabilized. He found a routine, one that allowed him to feed his urges while appearing completely normal to the world. And that's why this case remains one of the most disturbing in British criminal history. Not because of the brutality of the murders, not because of the scale of the necrophilia, but because of how easily he fit in. A husband, a father, a colleague, a friend, a technician, people trusted with access to the most sensitive parts of the hospital. He was everywhere and nowhere. Every day he walked past nurses, patients, grieving families, newborns, the elderly, doctors, janitors, visitors, bodies, He existed in plain sight, invisible because no one could even imagine what he was capable of. And that is the true horror of David Fuller's story, the realization that the most monstrous criminals don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they live right among us, smiling, working, blending in, waiting for the moment where no one is watching. A monster that hides is frightening. A monster that doesn't need to hide is terrifying. What shook investigators the most wasn't just the extent of David Fuller's crimes. It was how close he came, over and over again, to being caught. And how every single time, something or someone failed to stop him. One former colleague later admitted that she once walked past the morgue late in the evening and noticed a faint light under the door. She thought she heard movement inside, but assumed it was a pathologist working late. She didn't check. Why would she? In a hospital, people work at strange hours. And David Fuller, with his keys and his badge, always looked like he belonged. Another staff member remembered seeing him several times walking out of the morgue corridor, sweaty, breathing heavily, carrying his toolbox even when no work had been scheduled. When questioned years later, the staff member said he assumed David had been dealing with electrical wiring. The morgue's lighting system is old, you know. No one imagined the truth. And perhaps the most chilling detail came from a junior technician who once joked that David spent more time in the morgue than the actual mortuary staff. Everyone laughed at the remark at the time. Became a kind of running joke among the maintenance team. If they had known why, no one would have laughed. As investigators pieced the timeline together, the truth became painfully clear. David Fuller committed his crimes in a perfect storm of trust, neglect, professional respect, and institutional weakness. He didn't break into the morgue. He didn't force his way in. He didn't sneak through air vents or hack security systems. The doors were simply open to him. And once inside, he closed them behind him. The CCTV cameras didn't see him. The logbooks didn't track him. The staff didn't question him. The hospitals didn't supervise him. The system didn't protect the dead. And the living had no idea. If anything defines this case, it's the unbearable thought that it could have been prevented. One locked door, one staff member checking a register, one supervisor noticing the unusual activity, one policy actually enforced, just one. Instead, David Fuller enjoyed uninterrupted access to the one place in the hospital where no one could stop him, not even the victims. But the moment the police confronted him with the DNA match for the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, everything began to unravel. The composed, helpful, unremarkable electrician cracked, not emotionally, but strategically. He realized the past he thought he had buried was finally digging itself out, clawing back into the daylight after 33 years underground. The murders are what caught the police's attention. But the necrophilia is what showed them what he truly was. When detectives confronted David with the footage found in his hard drives, the thousands of images and videos, they expected denial, rage, excuses, anything. Instead, he simply nodded, as if they'd confronted him about an overdue bill, not the most grotesque crimes ever recorded in a British hospital. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask how much they'd seen. He simply acknowledged it, like he had been expecting this moment, like he knew deep down that one day the door was bound to open and someone would finally look inside. One of the detectives later said something that haunted him for months. He looked relieved. Investigators believe that David Fuller wasn't worried about being caught for the necrophilic acts because he didn't think anyone would ever suspect them. What terrified him was the murder DNA. The two crimes he committed against living victims, the ones who had fought, who had screamed, who had resisted. But the morgue victims, he considered them safe, untraceable, silent, perfect. When questioned, David refused to explain what drove him. He refused psychological evaluations. He refused to talk about the murders beyond the bare minimum. He didn't deny the necrophilia, but he didn't elaborate. He knew that the files spoke louder than anything he could say. Forensic analysts noticed something else. His recordings were precise, organized, clinical. Every file saved, every session documented, every body cataloged. He treated his crimes like a grotesque hobby, a private archive, a collection. The dead couldn't resist. But David Fuller didn't just want control. He wanted permanence. He wanted a record. He wanted to revisit his crimes. He wanted to relive them again and again. Even necrophilia wasn't enough. He needed proof of his domination. Proof he could watch whenever he wanted. And that's why ultimately, he was caught. The one thing that gave him comfort became the very thing that destroyed him. As the investigation expanded, the scale of David Fuller's double life became impossible to ignore. There was no more question about who he was. The question now was how someone like him could have remained invisible for so long. And more painfully, how many opportunities there had been to stop him. Police dove deeper into his past, speaking to former neighbors, colleagues, friends, even old acquaintances who hadn't seen him in 30 years. What emerged was a portrait as chilling as it was ordinary. Everyone said the same thing. He was quiet. He was polite. He kept to himself. He wasn't the type to cause trouble. The kind of man people forget the moment they stop talking to him. One former co-worker from the Kent and Sussex Hospital remembered having lunch with him a few times in the early 2000s. David was always alone in the cafeteria, eating in the same spot every day. He would nod politely, smile mechanically, then return to his food as if social interaction drained him. Another colleague recalled that David once offered to fix his bathroom wiring at home for free. He described him as helpful but strange, someone who showed no emotion, no enthusiasm, no warmth. He wasn't unfriendly, just empty, like he was performing humanity rather than living it. Detectives took note of these details because they matched a pattern seen in countless disturbing cases: a man who wears a flawless mask in public, but whose real face emerges only in private. A man who lives a life carefully compartmentalized into two worlds, one clean, one unimaginable. The deepest horror came from the discovery that David Fuller's necrophilic acts weren't impulsive or chaotic. They were planned, structured, almost ritualistic. He didn't enter the morgue randomly. He had favorite days, favorite hours, favorite types of victims, favorite methods. He repeated behaviors, repeated poses, repeated violations, as though trying to perfect something only he understood. And as the police cross-referenced the morgue's admission register with the timestamps in David's videos, a monstrous pattern emerged. He sometimes returned to the same corpse several days in a row, as if revisiting an object he was unwilling to let go. That discovery changed everything for the families. Until then, many had believed that what happened to their loved ones, horrific as it was, had been a single violation. But the files showed that David had sometimes assaulted the same deceased person multiple times, sometimes over a period of days, even weeks. For the families, the grief became unmanageable. Not one loss, but repeated desecration. Police officers described the process of identifying victims as emotionally devastating. Each match meant calling a family, sometimes years after the funeral, to tell them that their loved one, their child, their mother, their grandmother, had been violated in ways no human being should ever hear about. One officer said he cried in his car before making those calls. Another admitted he had to take several weeks of leave after watching the footage. One more described the material as the worst evidence ever found in British criminal history. Meanwhile, experts tried to piece together the psychology of this man who had managed to commit atrocities at work while maintaining a banal, peaceful life at home. Every psychologist who studied the case reached the same unsettling conclusion. David Fuller lived in a state of perfect emotional detachment. He didn't see the bodies as people. He didn't see death as a boundary. He didn't see women as human beings. He saw corpses as objects, accessible, silent, controllable. And he saw morgues as playgrounds, safe, predictable, unguarded. One forensic psychiatrist described him as a predator who needed the dead because the living were too risky. That observation hit investigators hard because it suggested his necrophilia wasn't a deviation from murder. It was an evolution. He killed Wendy and Caroline in 1987 because, at that time, killing was his only way to obtain what he wanted. But after escaping justice, after being questioned and released, after realizing how close he had come to getting caught, David learned a crucial lesson. A living victim is dangerous. A dead victim is perfect. From that moment on, he adapted. The morgue became the place where his impulses met zero resistance. No struggle, no witnesses, no forensic risk, no missing person reports, no police investigations, just him and a body that couldn't fight back. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated shift. He didn't stop being a killer. He simply stopped needing to kill to get what he wanted. Necrophilia wasn't the exception. It was the solution he found to keep going for 33 years. When investigators finally confronted David Fuller with everything they had uncovered, they expected denial, panic, maybe even tears. What they got instead was something far more unsettling: calm. He listened to the accusations as if they were describing someone else. He didn't protest. He didn't get angry. He didn't break down. His face remained almost perfectly expressionless, like a man listening to a weather report. When detectives told him that his DNA matched the killer of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce, he simply blinked slowly and said, "I can't explain that." When they revealed the existence of the hard drives and the videos he had filmed himself, he nodded once as if accepting a minor inconvenience. "Yes, those are mine." Even when they pushed him on the details, the morgue, the bodies, the assaults, he never showed the slightest sign of emotion. No remorse, no shame, no shock, nothing. One detective later said, "Talking to him was like talking to a wall that knew exactly what you were saying, but refused to care." What disturbed the investigators the most wasn't what David admitted, it was what he refused to acknowledge. Every time they tried to push him about why he did it, what he felt, what drove him, what went through his mind, he shrugged. "I don't know. It just happened. I can't remember. I don't really have anything to say." A man who had filmed thousands of acts over 15 years suddenly had nothing to say. Experts quickly understood what was happening. David Fuller wasn't cooperating because he didn't feel like he had done anything wrong. In his mind, his urges weren't crimes. They were needs. Needs he had managed to satisfy for decades without consequences. A predator who believes he is normal is the most dangerous kind of predator of all. While David maintained his emotionless facade, the public reaction across the UK became explosive. Newspapers published front-page headlines calling him the monster of the morgue and Britain's most perverted killer. Families demanded justice. Nurses, doctors, and hospital workers were heartbroken to learn what had happened in the very place where they dedicated their lives to helping people. But the most heartbreaking reactions came from the families of the victims. Some had lost children, some had lost parents, some had lost grandparents. All of them had buried their loved ones, believing that at the very least their bodies were treated with dignity. Now they learned the truth. One mother broke down in tears during an interview, unable to finish a sentence. Another father said he wished he had never opened the letter from the police. A grieving sister said she needed therapy just to sleep again. Another family refused to watch any news for months because they couldn't bear hearing their loved one's name associated with what David had done. Many families described the pain as a second death. But the suffering didn't end there. Because with every forensic discovery, every file, every timestamp, every folder recovered from David's hard drives, more victims were identified. The number kept rising and rising and rising. What started as one criminal case against a double murderer grew into one of the largest victim notifications in British history. Police had to contact families one by one. Each call was worse than the last. Some families were told their loved ones had been assaulted once. Others, several times. One body had been violated on 3 different days, another on 6, one even more. Every new revelation made the case more nightmarish. Every detail pushed the limit of what people thought a human being was capable of. And behind it all was David Fuller, the quiet electrician who rode his bike, took nature photos, listened to 80s music, and told his children he loved them. The contrast was so extreme, so unnatural, that even seasoned criminal psychologists struggled to explain it. One expert said, "He lived 2 lives so separate that it's almost as if one erased the other." Another said, "He didn't hide because he was afraid of being caught. He hid because he didn't think anyone would ever look for him." The trial was the moment the public finally saw the full scope of the horror, and the moment David Fuller, still emotionless, faced the consequences he'd avoided for 33 years. As the trial opened in December 2021, the courtroom was already filled with attention so heavy you could almost reach out and touch it. Families of victims sat in silence, eyes fixed on the man who had rewritten their grief with the darkest ink imaginable. Reporters lined the back rows, Even seasoned police officers, the ones who had seen all the images no human should ever see, sat rigidly in their seats. And then David Fuller walked in. No handcuffs, no struggle, no emotion. He took his seat like he was attending a routine administrative meeting. One journalist described his expression as permanently hollow, as if whatever humanity had once lived behind his eyes had long since evacuated. When the charges were read aloud, murder, sexual assault, desecration of corpses, the courtroom shifted. A wave of disgust broke through the room. Some victims' families had to step out. Others stayed, fists clenched, jaws trembling with the unbearable mix of rage and heartbreak. But David didn't react. Not once. Not to his name. Not to the word murder. Not even when the prosecutor began to describe in cold detail what he had done in those morgue rooms. The prosecutor began with the murders, Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce. He described the brutality, the violence, the absolute certainty that these young women had fought for their lives. He reminded the court how, for 33 years, the murderer had lived freely, while their families lived in torment. And then, slowly, methodically, he transitioned to the morgue files. That was the moment the room changed. Even the judge seemed taken aback. It's rare, extremely rare, for a judge to show visible emotion. But as soon as the prosecutor mentioned tens of thousands of images, there was a sudden silence so sharp it felt like the air had frozen. More than 14,000 photographs and videos. 140 documented assaults. Victims aged 9 to 100. Families who had trusted the hospital to protect their loved ones, unaware that their final resting place had become a predator's hunting ground. Each video had a timestamp. Each folder had a name. Each entry had notes, his notes. When the prosecutor read out those notes, you could see people in the courtroom physically recoil. "This is depravity without precedent," the judge whispered at one point, unable to contain himself. And David? Nothing. Not a blink. Not a tremor. Not the slightest human reaction. One forensic expert testified that the way David cataloged his victims resembled the behavior of a collector, someone who wasn't just satisfying a compulsive urge but building an archive, a legacy of horror, evidence of a parallel life he was proud of, even if he never said it aloud. The psychologist who examined him described him as emotionally flat, capable of compartmentalizing his cruelty so completely that he could assault a corpse, then go home and watch TV with his wife like it was the most normal thing in the world. The courtroom learned that the murders in 1987 weren't random explosions of violence. They were the early signs of the darker obsession that would define the rest of his life. Wendy and Caroline had been brutally attacked, beaten, and strangled, but the sexual assault was the real motive. Necrophilia wasn't a byproduct, it was the ultimate goal. For 33 years, he avoided killing again, not because he grew remorseful, but because he found a safer alternative. A way to indulge his urges every time he wanted, without risk, without witnesses, without resistance. The morgue had become his sanctuary. As the horror unfolded, one question echoed through the courtroom, though no one dared ask it aloud. How many victims were never identified? How many files did he delete? How many acts did he never record? How many families would never know? Even today, no expert can give a precise answer. But every psychologist who analyzed David Fuller agreed on one thing. The scale of his crimes is likely far larger than anything found on those hard drives. When the family spoke in court, the atmosphere broke. Mothers cried until they couldn't breathe. Husbands begged for answers. Siblings asked why nobody stopped him sooner. Some asked why the hospital failed them so catastrophically. Others simply asked why this man, this quiet, polite, cycling enthusiast electrician, had chosen their loved one's body as an object. David looked at none of them. Not once. Not for a second. He stared straight ahead, like someone who already knew the end of the story and didn't care how many people he destroyed along the way. The judge, visibly shaken, did not hold back. He described the murders as deeply shocking, but the necrophilia as depravity scarcely imaginable. He added that in 40 years of legal experience, he had never encountered anything so grotesque, so calculated, so spiritually corrosive. Then he turned to David Fuller and said, "You lived your entire life as if the dead existed solely for your exploitation. You violated them. You humiliated them. You desecrated them. The pain you inflicted is immeasurable." The sentence was handed down. Life in prison, without possibility of parole, ever. The courtroom exhaled, not in relief, but in exhaustion. Because justice had been served, yes, but nothing could erase what David Fuller had done. Nothing could restore the dignity he stole. Nothing could give the families back the peace they once had. Nothing could make the horror disappear. And David Fuller remained silent. When the sentence was finally pronounced, the courtroom slowly emptied, but the shock didn't stop at the courthouse doors. Across the country, the revelation spread like a stain. A collective horror settling over the UK. And in the days that followed, another question echoed everywhere. From newspapers to Parliament, how could this have happened for so long? Inside a hospital. Inside a place meant to protect the living and honor the dead. The answer, unfortunately, was as complex as it was disturbing. In the weeks after David Fuller's conviction, the British government launched a full independent national inquiry, and the deeper they dug, the more unforgivable failures they uncovered. Failures that had stretched over decades, across 2 hospitals, dozens of departments, and hundreds of staff members. The inquiry revealed that the morgues where David operated had been, quite literally, wide-open playgrounds for someone like him. Access logs were either missing or never checked. Security cameras didn't cover critical blind spots. Keys were passed around casually. And worst of all, multiple bodies were regularly left outside refrigeration overnight. It wasn't just negligence. It was neglect on a catastrophic scale. Investigators learned that David often entered the morgue at times when nobody should have been there. Evenings, weekends, holidays. He caused breakdowns on purpose, so he'd have a reason to show up. He slipped in during shift changes. He memorized camera blind angles. He falsified his own access logs. And when he really wanted to avoid suspicion, he simply locked the door behind him. The inquiry concluded that the hospital's security systems hadn't just failed, they had practically assisted him like an invisible accomplice. But the most painful part of the investigation was the human cost. Thousands of families received letters and phone calls telling them that a loved one's body might have been violated. It was impossible to to identify every victim with absolute certainty. Some families were informed directly that their relative was among the confirmed victims. Others, thousands of others, lived in an unbearable limbo, never knowing whether David had touched their loved one or not. Imagine grieving someone, burying them, trying to move on, and then years later, learning that their final moments were not peaceful, that their dignity was stolen, that their body became someone's playground. It shattered people. Psychological support teams were overwhelmed. Phone lines remained open 24/7. Some families couldn't bring themselves to watch the news. Others spiraled into depression. For many, it wasn't just grief. It was betrayal. Because hospitals are sacred places. Places where suffering is eased, where life ends with dignity, where families trust professionals with the people they love the most. And that trust had been shattered by one man. But the inquiry revealed something else. Something worse. Something nobody wanted to say out loud. David Fuller should never have been hired in the first place. He had lied on his job application about his criminal record, burglaries, voyeurism, intrusions into homes occupied by women. Yet no one checked. Not in 1989. Not in 2002 when he was promoted. Not in 2011 when his contract transferred to a private company. Not ever. For 31 years, he had not undergone a single security screening. Not one background check, not one performance review. Nothing. His employers simply assumed he was harmless. And he taught them all a brutal lesson. Evil doesn't always wear fangs. Sometimes it wears a uniform, fixes a light, and smiles politely in the corridor. When the inquiry's final report was published, the findings stunned the country, not only because of David Fuller's crimes, but because they exposed a system so flawed that someone like him could navigate it effortlessly. Hospitals across the UK began to overhaul their morgue security protocols. New CCTV coverage, strict supervision rules, digital access logs, mandatory background checks, staff retraining, unannounced audits. Changes that were necessary, but tragically too late for the victims. Meanwhile, psychologists around the world began studying David's profile. His case was rare, extremely rare. Necrophilia remains one of the most uncommon and least understood paraphilias. And yet David practiced it with precision, organization, and a complete absence of remorse. What disturbed experts the most wasn't what he did. It was the coldness with which he did it. He didn't collect trophies from the murders he committed in 1987, but he did collect trophies from corpses, names, dates, notes, thousands of files. One criminal psychologist described him as a man whose depravity was only matched by his ability to pretend to be ordinary. That was David Fuller's true power. Not violence, not intelligence, not charm, but invisibility. He blended in so perfectly that he became part of the walls. The kind of man people described as quiet, polite, helpful, harmless. But in reality, behind those dull eyes and harmless habits, he was building a secret world, a world where he controlled everything, where nobody could stop him, where nobody could escape him, not even in death. And although his crimes finally ended in December 2020, when the police knocked on his door, the damage he left behind is permanent. It still lives in the halls of Tunbridge Wells Hospital, in the files of the inquiry, in the hearts of hundreds of families, and in the history of the UK's darkest criminal cases.